Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Joy. I'm really grateful to have you to talk to you this afternoon. My reason for contacting you, Joy, was because I wondered if there were specific resonances with the experience of the virus and social isolation for those who've been to boarding school.
I think that's a really interesting question, Alice, and thank you for inviting me to talk about this and to think about it. So yes, I mean, I think there really are some resonances here. And I'd sort of like to talk a little bit about what I call the ABCD of boarding school syndrome, first of all, because I think it's relevant. So I call it the ABCD. Conveniently, the letters of the words all fit in. So abandonment, bereavement, captivity are all experiences of the child sent to boarding school. And that has the effect of the child has to have an armoured sort of presentation to survive it. So they disassociate. So we start with A, which is abandonment. The child, and very often these children are really quite young, as we know, 7, 8, sometimes younger, sometimes a little bit older. But each of these children experiences a sense of abandonment when they are sent to boarding school. And even if they thought that they wanted to go to boarding school, when they get there, they're absolutely shocked by the parents just leave. And although they'd known that in a way, it hadn't really registered. And so many people say this, you know, there's a sense of total bewilderment, complete lack of comprehension, you know, because parents don't do this. Parents don't leave their children with strangers. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of so against even what children know and expect. Mm-hmm. And that's not idealizing families. It's just, you know, children grow up in a place with people. And the younger the child, I think the more incomprehensible it is and more confusing and bewildering. So the child from the very moment feels abandoned, and there are wonderful descriptions in the literature, hundreds really by different writers who've written about this experience. Roald Dahl, Andrew Motion, I mean, you could just go on and describe that moment of abandonment, the moment of the realization. So that's the A. The B is bereavement. And I call it bereavement. There's a word called homesickness. There's a term called homesickness, which we're very familiar with. You know, children get homesick. They are told, don't worry, it's just homesickness. Go and do some sport, or go and do this. You'll be all right soon. You know, it'll take a few days, but you'll be all right. But actually, they aren't all right, because if we really look at what's happened to them, the children are bereaved. They've lost everything. They've lost everyone in their life. They've lost their parents. They've lost their siblings. They've lost everything that's familiar. They've lost their bed, the food they're used to, the pattern and rhythm of their day school that they probably went to as a little child. Everything has changed from that moment. And so the child is suffering really major loss, and it's appropriate to grieve. And in my book, I kind of looked at Colin Murray Parkes and how he talks about bereavement and the stages of bereavement, and that is what the children go through. It's a really, really kind of big, profound loss that is never recovered from, really. I don't think it's ever recovered from.
And a bereavement that's not permitted. Presumably you're only allowed to be homesick at the beginning of term, and then you have to get over it, as if it's something that, you know, you're not allowed to experience this.
No, you're not allowed to have emotions, especially ones where you cry.
Yeah.
And so the grief is, it's often somatized. One colleague who was a GP working in one of the major public schools observed of children that they would come complaining of a tummy ache. And really they hadn't got the words for what was happening, because what parents do is they help children process experience. So what we do for our children is, when they don't quite understand, they don't want to go to school, they don't feel well, it's because they're anxious, and we give them words and say, perhaps you're feeling a bit worried about something that's happening today. So all the time parents do that without realizing that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And so the child misses out on all that. They miss out. They grow up without love from the moment that they're left. A child growing up without love. And I'm not idealizing families, because I know some families are really difficult and they're not always particularly loving, but what they are is familiar. And that word familiar, family, I think is a very significant word in this context.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, after that, so the child has to learn to live without love, to live with strangers, with unfamiliar adults, and with other children who are sometimes quite kind, but they're the wrong children. They're not the siblings, they're not the friends that they know. So even if they try to comfort them, there is no comfort. So this crying under the covers at night, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, is really profound. And of course, the child is captive in a boarding school.
Yeah.
They are, they're kind of, it's an environment that's absolutely opposite of a child-centered environment. Then it's about children, but it's not child-centered. It's not about being led by the child, by, what do you want to do today? Everything is regimented. And you have to wear a uniform, you go to bed at certain times, you eat at certain times, you have to eat the food you're given. It's like prison. It is prison. And if you escape, you're brought back. Many people describe how that happened to them, that very few people who escape from boarding school, run away, are not brought back, or they're brought back and punished for it. Just very occasionally, the parents get to know about this and they actually realize the child's unhappy and take them out, but that's very, very rare. You have to learn to deal with it. So they have to wear a uniform, and they're only allowed out if the adults, like the warders, permit them to go out. So they live in a captive environment. They have to adapt to rules which at first make no sense whatsoever, and later on structure their lives so that there's no time for reverie or the kind of emotional boredom, the kind of boredom that we sit around sometimes and make creative things out of.
Yes, without any private space either.
Yes. Yes, I mean, there are no private spaces, and often people describe, I don't know if it's like that now, but, the lavatories used to have no doors, because that was one private space where all sorts of things might go on that wouldn't be okay. And so privacy is at a premium, really. Some people describe the grounds and going off and playing on their own sometimes in the grounds, and that, for some people, that kind of constituted a place of reverie where they could be alone, but a lot of people didn't have that experience.
Yeah, interesting. So when we consider the ABC of the boarding school experience and we map that on to coronavirus, all of us having to isolate into our homes and not be able to leave, not be able to contact the people that we might normally regularly see, our therapist, how do you think this might impact?
Well, I think it's work in progress, really.
Yeah.
And I think we're all learning. And I think it's a really interesting question, Alice. But the first, I should say the D as well, maybe say a little bit about dissociation, because the result of being sent away the way the children are is that they have to learn to cope. So they have to have a shell that apparently protects them. So they're insulated. So often there's a kind of armor, a kind of toughness presentation that the child learns and often carries into adulthood. And that is actually underneath that is really strong disassociation. So that when we're working, trying to get to the root of the problem is very difficult, because the person just is so unaware of how unhappy they were. It has been completely cut off. So that's the work we're doing. So I think this current situation is really Well, it's potentially replaying a lot of it, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. Mm.
I mean, what we're having in a way, you know, people are having to abandon their way of life, their work.
Yeah.
I mean, most people are not shut away. Some people are shut away from their families or part of their families, though.
Mm.
You can't visit relatives, you can't visit siblings, you can't visit parents. So there is something about the captivity of people working from home, deprived of being together with colleagues, although some people are finding online that they're managing that rather well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was thinking about the, you know, the weekly phone call or the letter home or whatever, and how we're sort of in that situation now where you can make a phone call or you can Skype somebody, but you cannot be with them and you cannot be held by them or hold them.
That's really important, isn't it? Is the
Yeah.
physical presence of a person, the real, the impersonation, I don't know if that's the right word in this subject, but the bodily presence of another.
Yeah.
And for people living alone, that's real deprivation. It's terribly hard.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I think it is. And yes, it's replaying that, isn't it? For people who had to write that letter home, the letter home very often was censored. The teachers would read the letters, and if it wasn't right, you'd have to write it again. You can't say that to your parents. So it wasn't as if it was a genuine letter. People found ways, inventive ways of kind of making little symbols on their letter that their parents would know what it meant, like "I love you" or something like that, because it was hard to write something like that. But and so I suppose in a way that's what we are getting into, that kind of deprivation, and it's going on for at least a term. You know, 3 months is a term.
Yes, exactly. There's some parallels there as well. And I remember the other day when we were talking, and you mentioned something which reminds me of a sort of tantalising object, whereby the person is available yet not available. And that is very much the experience of the boarding school child, and potentially of any person who has had a tantalising parent who was sometimes available and would then not be available, and how this situation recreates something of that.
Yes, I think that's really important, because it's not just ex-boarders that are experiencing this.
No.
And lots of people are, and for different reasons it replays for them too. But that tantalising thing of the parent who could come and take you out for an exeat, a day out at the weekend, with, you know, with permission, and then you're suddenly deprived of the parent again. And at the beginning, a lot of people talk about how it wasn't the first term or the first half term that was really bad, it was the second, because the realization that this is going to go on and on and on. And for a child, you know, a year is eternity, ever. And so, yes, I think it does replay. So as therapists, I think, you know, we have to be alert to this, don't we?
Yeah.
To be very aware that people are feeling deprived.
Deprived. Yeah, exactly that. And unconscious processes that might be from very early life that were then replicated by a boarding school experience that are then brought to the surface now during this pandemic. So I suppose it's a question of technique, and how does one hold the frame and carry on working with clients who you might have been working with face to face who are possibly experiencing this.
Well, I think first of all, it's getting people to accept that they will accept sessions on the telephone or through Zoom or whatever method you're offering them, because a lot of people don't want to do it. Because I think, without being conscious of its deprivation, I think it feels too much like that. And so certainly, you know, talking to colleagues, thinking about it, you know, people are saying, actually, I don't want to do it. And so I'll wait till we can meet again. And I heard from a colleague today who actually said that somebody who she'd spoken to on the phone, who didn't want to do it, who thought it really wouldn't work, actually after the session felt that it hadn't been too bad. And I think that's the thing. If you can get someone to try it, they may not find it too bad. But a lot of people are very embarrassed about Skype or Zoom because you see yourself as well, you know, if you look. And so you kind of, you're watching yourself perform in a sense.
Yes.
It's kind of, it's a very strange method. But I mean, I do work on Zoom quite a lot with people who live abroad.
Okay.
And they are mostly ex-boarders. You know, they have high-powered jobs and they're not in this country and they really want to do the work. And I generally try and refer them to people in the country where they are or who can actually, they can reach in person. But I've realized that if it's kind of online or nothing, it's better to offer online. Some people have found it very useful, but I think that, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, how do you get beyond the replication of the child that's at boarding school, maybe in England, and the parents that live and work abroad? And then how do you not become, you know, idealized mother figure millions of miles away? I mean, can you get to a sort of negative transference, or however you might want to?
Well, that's a really interesting thing, because I think getting to the negative is difficult when the person's not in the room because it's too risky. I think we have to be very aware of the transference, and sometimes you can get to it, but in the same way as you do ordinarily with when you hear it in the material, where you can bring it in, and over time you get to know each other well enough for the person to be able to bear thinking about the negative, because the parent isn't always idealized either. They might be idealized, but then they're also hated as well for being so negligent, for being so, having better things to do than have me at home.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's the being aware of the transference. There's transference like there always is transference, and this is the top layer of the transference, that, you know, we're communicating in this way, which is tantalising and depriving and all those other things that we said. But actually also we can think about it, because we aren't actually doing that. And it's the thing that generally parents who send their children to boarding school don't want to hear how awful it is.
No.
And so the child knows that, and the school doesn't want them to do that either. So there is a kind of conspiracy of nobody saying, you know, well, actually, this teacher's beating me, or, you know, they don't do that now, thank goodness. But they can do it in other ways. They can be cruel, and they are sometimes very cruel with their tongues, as it were. But it's hard to tell the parent, and the parent's not listening because the parent doesn't want to hear. You know, when people know that somehow in the next term this abuser is going to turn their attention to them, try and tell their parents, the parents quite often don't want to hear. And it's very hard for the child to articulate it. And if the child does manage to articulate it, they're often told, don't worry about it, you'll be fine, you know. And that's what is so really hard. And I think what's different in therapy, hopefully, is that we can listen, and we shut up and listen, and we'll listen to just how bad it is and just how bad it was. And I think that does make a difference. It's not ideal. I think, you know, we're used to having people in the room and letting them get very angry with us and slam the door as they leave. That is harder online, but it is possible, because, you know, people don't turn up for sessions, they forget to pay you. There's also all of the same things go on, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that I mean, often in psychotherapy circles, you would talk about much earlier trauma being the dominant unconscious activator in a person's life, and that anything that happens sort of at an older age is less relevant. And I wonder if that's true. I wonder if actually the boarding school experience can be even more shattering than an early relational difficulty, or equally.
Well, I think they often go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Very often the parent, you know, there are some parents that won't send their children away no matter what. And there are some parents who, some mothers particularly, who really regretted it and didn't want their children to go, but it was the family tradition, or it was the father's family tradition, and they let them go. So I think sometimes children who are brought up by nannies have very little contact with their parents, and the nanny can become the most important person in their life. And you know, from when they're very, very young, and very often the nanny is dismissed when they go to boarding school at 7. It's very common, and that's like a huge trauma, because the parents are kind of hands off. So that's in the more wealthy families. Some families people mean well when they send their children to boarding school on the whole. You know, it's not really to blame the parents. My project is not to blame parents, but to alert them.
Yes.
You know, they mean well, but listen to your adult child now. They want to tell you something, and they want to tell you what it was like for them. And some parents can do that. Some parents can't bear to do that. And I wonder if that goes back right to the very beginning, you know, the early parenting. I think you've got a point that, you know, the very act of sending a child away to boarding school goes so against the sense of being a parent in some ways.
Absolutely. It's dissociated decision making, it seems to me.
It is really. I mean, when I had the book launch for my book, I had my grandchildren there. And at the time they were 10, 6 and 4. And I got them to stand beside me, and I said, which one of these would you choose to send away to boarding school? And that really got to people, because all those ages are ages when people go.
Yeah.
And the 10-year-old, you know, the big one, is tiny.
Yeah.
You would never let her out of your sight.
No, you wouldn't let them go to the park on their own.
No. And yet you leave them with these potential abusers.
Yeah.
And that was so common.
Yeah. So I mean, bringing it back to now, I think that for most people who have a trauma history, anything traumatic could be triggered by what's happening now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very frightening time for all of us.
It is.
Really unknown. And I think as therapists, you know, we have to have places where we can talk about it and manage ourselves, because actually we're affected too. I mean, the plants are in this place, but so are we. You know, we're worried about loved ones, we're, you know, stranded. So it's a very unusual situation where they know, our clients know stuff about us they wouldn't normally know. They know we can't be in our consulting rooms. They know we're isolated, like they are. So it's all. I think we have to just be very alert and sensitive. And I think what's really important is not to put everything onto transference. Like, you know, people are concerned for our welfare as well as, you know, their loved ones. And I think so. That's real. So I think, you know, we need to be with the real as well as the
so allowing for that concern for the therapist's well-being, and, you know, who they're living with, and what they're up to, and are they properly isolating and things like that. There could be some real anxieties.
Well, there could be, and I think we have to, as usual with transference, we have to manage acknowledging their concern without necessarily giving them the answers to all those things. But like letting people know that actually we have ways of taking care of ourselves too. So
a final question. I mean, I think you've just answered it really, but I was going to ask if you had any particular advice or for anybody who might be working with a boarding school, an ex-boarder right now, and how they might consider, thinking about this transition to online work?
Well, yes, I don't know that I've got a lot of advice because I need the advice for myself as well.
I
Yeah,
know, I know.
there are some people that one has worked with intensely and totally face to face. I said I've worked with some people on Zoom, but a lot of the work is face to face, and it is a big transition. And we have to learn to be with each other in a different way and to relax into it. And that's going to take a little time. But I think we can do it. It's almost like you can chat to your friends on the phone quite easily. And sometimes if people aren't well, I've done it. You sometimes just have to adapt.
And actually, there's so much about adaptation and how, what are we aiming for at the end of an analysis? Well, we all know that it isn't about sort of, rainbows and stuff, but it's more about being able to be more resilient and more adaptive. So perhaps actually going through this could be helpful to think about how to be.
Maybe it's forcing us all to be a little bit more relational than we had been.
Without breaking the frame.
Without breaking the frame. And it's that's the thing that we have to hold. Yeah. And we have to hold it as best we can. And consult colleagues, I think, which is really important because we're all learning it, we're all doing it. And thinking together about it, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I mean, is there anything else that you wanted to communicate or talk about before we come to a close?
Well, I was just thinking about what we talked about before, was about what role we have to play in this crisis beyond our current clients. Yes. And whether we have something to offer and whether, that would be useful. And I think we do and we will have going forward, really. And it may just be consultations on telephone or Zoom, but perhaps we can offer that to people who have suffered trauma, who are bereaved, who people working at the front line, people who are frightened, really frightened or isolated by it. But I'm not sure that we've got that organised yet. Then it may be that there are, we need to look into that. You may know, I don't know whether.
Yeah, I don't know. So it almost like a sort of informal listening service. I think that's what you mentioned before. So
I think that is, yes, that we have skills that certainly can be used. Yeah. And even if we're in isolation ourselves, we can offer kind of trauma work, short-term perhaps, which is maybe what people like me don't usually do, short-term work, but maybe there is a role for that.
Yes, with somebody who is experiencing the trauma right now, you mean, as a piece of work to sort of get them through the next couple of months, the next few months.
Yes. And to manage people's anxiety, because there must be a lot of people who are terribly anxious, and a lot of people who are bereaved and can't go to the funerals or can only go, one person can go, or 3 people can go to a funeral, I think. And that, those people, and then they're living on their own. It just is really unbearable to think about, isn't it?
A lot about the situation is actually unbearable to think about, I think, when you get to the nub of what is coming up in the next couple of weeks. And I think that if any psychotherapist has any bandwidth and can offer some free therapy or low-cost therapy to healthcare workers, or as you say, anyone vulnerable in the community, I think that will be an enormous help. I think there'll be an enormous need for it. But bearing in mind that a psychotherapist is probably feeling quite burdened as it is with a traumatized caseload, and
exactly, that actually many of us haven't got the emotional space for it, because actually taking care of ourselves is really important too.
And of course, after, there might be quite a lot of work to do when this has passed.
Yes.
In all sorts of different ways that we don't yet know.
I think that's right, because it's almost like we're in the middle of the trauma, and then afterwards, then the post-traumatic phase might be the time when we could help people manage what they've experienced, what they've seen. I mean, one other thing that we did talk about and I thought about was how the government is composed of people who went, a huge proportion of people who went to boarding school. 11 went to Eton. 4 of them went to Winchester. And it's quite interesting how that plays out in the way they talk to each other. And I'm wondering whether that is also playing out or could play out in the way that the rules are developed to make us behave ourselves, and whether there is something there about, I mean, I don't know, because at the moment you just feel, it seems like everyone's doing the best thing for all of us and telling us what to do, and we're all going along with it. But there is something about having a boss, a headmaster, who's telling us what's good for us, and a lot of prefects who are replaying it. And I just wonder, I mean, it's just the thought at the moment, but you know, there is a thread in this British culture which is very strong at the moment in terms of boarding school.
Yes. I mean, do you want to speak any more about that on a more sort of specific, how you think that might impact us in our homes and how this situation is managed?
I don't yet know. I'm just a little bit alert to it. I mean, I've been very aware of it in the past, obviously, because the Conservative government is often composed of very many people who did go to boarding school, and they've learnt in the debating society how to talk to each other and how to behave, and they sometimes play that out in the House of Commons.
In my interview with Graham Music, interestingly, we talked about Bion for a moment, and Bion went to boarding school from the age of 6. And what he said was that, well, you know, he was also a tank commander and he had extraordinary good defences against terror. And in actual fact, is that not exactly what we need right now?
Well, that is also true. I think that's brilliant. Yes, it's absolutely true. And that's what they're trained for. That's what boarding school's all about. Go out and build empire and be a soldier and look after your men. And actually, they're absolutely excellently trained for that. I do think that's a very good point. Bion's a great example, isn't he? Because he describes it all so well, in a sense.
And he was really in touch with his inner world.
Yes.
And, was empathic. And so he could somehow bridge both.
Well, that is the ideal, isn't it, of that kind of education. And at its best, I think there is respect and compassion in what people are taught in boarding school. You know, the fair play thing, when it's really carried out, you know, the British fair play, when, you know, rules of war and all that.
But yeah, I suppose it's the capacity for thinking about those that are most vulnerable and most in need.
And self-reflection, you know, that's the thing, isn't it, too?
So we wait and see.
We do. Yes, I think it's work in progress, isn't it?
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been really, really interesting and helpful and engaging. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Alice, too.